Hi, I'm attorney Greg Dell with the law firm of Dell & Schaefer, and I'm here with Cesar Gavidia and Stephen Jessup. And today we're going to talk about dentists' long-term disability claims. And guys, we've helped probably hundreds of dentists around the country in all kinds of long-term disability claims. And in this video, I want to talk about things from the application process to the types of denials that we see and different scenarios that come up within the policies, whether it's a business overhead type policy, continuing to work or still owning a practice, all the different issues that we see with dentists. But I shouldn't say all of them because there's tons of issues, but we'll talk about the main ones. And Cesar, the starting point is really, in my mind, when a dentist calls us, is the definition of disability in the policy. What is the typical definition you see for a dentist's disability policy, and why is it important?
Well, typically you'll see a true own occupation disability policy. An individual disability policy will hold these occupation-specific definitions of disability. So generally you'll find that it'll say something to the effect of you're disabled when due to a sickness or injury, you're unable to perform the substantial material duties of your own occupation. And then they typically define your own occupation as the occupation you're performing at the time that you become disabled. So certainly if you're a dentist and you've been practicing general dentistry, or if you're a periodontist or an orthodontist, it's those specific duties and that specific occupation and specialty that you're performing at that specific time that you become disabled.
Okay, Steve, let's take off from what Cesar just said about what you're doing at the time you become disabled. And for dentists specifically, how does a dentist prove what they were doing at the time they became disabled?
Just like with doctors, medical professionals, they're going to look at the ADA codes, what you're billing for. That's going to determine what the percentages of practice and income coming in, your duties were, that you were doing. So that's how they're going to derive that. Another thing, kind of going back to the definitions of disability, one of the big things, especially with dentists and other medical professionals, is that also there's a lot of language where loss of a license, an occupational license, does not constitute a disability. So sometimes we've had clients who have had issues with their license, and then they're trying to, if you will, kind of bolster up a disability claim to try to get some money because they know from the disability carrier, because they know that their license is going to be in trouble or stuff like that. So that's something also to keep in mind. But ultimately, your job duties are what you bill for more than anything. So they're going to want details on a monthly basis, an annual basis, for up to sometimes 3 to 5 years prior to the date of disability.
All right, we've represented dentists who have all different kinds of practices. We have the solo practitioners, which is many of them, but now we've seen a lot of these group type practices where you have a dentist who owns the practice and then he has 1 or 2 or 3 associates, and that particular dentist who's filing a disability claim may not be doing a lot of procedures, yet when it comes time to file the claim isn't able to do any procedures. So Cesar, what happens for that dentist who now says, I can't do any dentistry, am I totally disabled, when that person has associates?
Well, as soon as we get involved with the claim, we have to do a complete analysis, and it's not just looking at what's happening at that point in time that they contact us, or even from the point that they've told us that they've stopped working. Because if you go back into the history of their medical condition, they could have been cutting back the volume of procedures and cases and patients that they've been seeing, or eliminating certain types of procedures because maybe they were too difficult to perform with whatever medical issues they're having. So we have to go back. It could even be a couple of years to determine if there's a particular loss there, to see if we could even establish, aside from a total disability claim from this time they've stopped working completely, perhaps a partial or residual disability claim from a time that they've started incurring a loss due to that medical issue.
It's interesting that you brought that up, because you reminded me now, most of the dentists who call me that we deal with the claims, I'm usually going back a significant period of time where they've worked through the condition and they've modified their practice in such a manner where they gave up procedures that they used to do. And like you said, they should have filed months or if not years ago. Now, Steve, what issues come up with them waiting periods of time?
Yeah, the policy's having this proof of loss notice of claim provision, so you have to notify the insurance company within a certain amount of time of a claim. Depending on facts, some carriers really will fight that, especially in real egregious. I know Cesar and I were speaking the other day about a case he has where, it was well over a decade past the time of disability, but the insurance carrier under the policy still had ways to, review. That does come in. I'm working on a case for a dentist right now where she had worked in a pediatric setting a couple of years back, and then she pulled out of that, tried to do just general with adults because it was easier to work on with children. In her situation, we have them agreeing as to the disability currently, and they're still reviewing because there was a hard time getting some of the codes and the billing from when she was doing pediatrics, but it does appear that we're going to be able to backdate that. And the argument usually becomes is this, that they weren't thinking about, oh, well, I've cut back, I should probably file my disability. When they own their own practices, especially, they're trying to figure out ways that they can continue to work. They see that as their livelihood. They don't see their disability policy as their livelihood. And it's usually only after, we take a look and a lawyer looks at it and says, well, listen, we think, yes, you have something clear cut right now, but there's something that happened in the past. And with what Cesar was saying too, and evaluating and looking backwards too, and to what your effect was is, maybe they're not doing as much because they have associates there. You can go back and really see what they were doing in the past to make sure that the occupation's being looked at back then as opposed to what they're currently, trying to file based on.
Right. Where I see most of the dentists have the biggest troubles is that, first of all, most dentists are significantly underinsured. Mm-hmm. And by that I mean they didn't buy enough coverage for themselves compared to what their earnings are. So they don't want to go on disability. Disability is a last resort because they really can't do their jobs. The problem is many of them have been working with the condition for not months, but years. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then they reach the point where they decide they're going to stop, and the disability carriers are like, well, why are you stopping now? You even, we see you've had years of documentation with this. You don't really have much of a reduction in what you're doing, but now you're telling us you can't do the work. And Cesar, how do you address that? Because that's most of your denials.
Yeah, the insurance company, and that's something that's very, we encounter so often that it's easy to anticipate that they're going to want to know, what's changed? We haven't seen a considerable reduction. How do you go from, seeing 6-7 patients a day to then suddenly seeing 0? It does require an analysis of their medical support and their medical records, and maybe speaking with their doctors to understand, well, why can't, Dr. So-and-so continue to do dentistry? Is it going to create a worsening of their condition? Are they going to exacerbate it? Do they run the risk of injuring a patient if they continue doing this? Certainly most of the disability claims that we encounter, they're not perfect, okay? Nothing is necessarily perfect in terms of an insurance claim, and the insurance companies, they know that and they take advantage of it. So, it's really going back, working with the doctors, working with the medical history that they have, and perhaps establishing some sort of basis to say that either the medical condition is going to get worse, that this is going to be something that they run the risk of injuring a patient with, and perhaps encountering and approaching it that way.
Well, here's the issue that comes up, and every dentist has this issue, and it's that malpractice. And the doctors, rightfully so, are scared to say, hey, last week I dropped my dental tool, or I accidentally slipped with the drill and nicked the gum. It could have been something worse. Or I did hit the nerve root when I shouldn't have. Now, how does the doctor report that, put it in their medical record when they're having that issue? One is, yeah, you have an incident like that, great for your disability claim, not so great from a malpractice issue, yet that may have happened weeks ago, months ago, now you keep working. I mean, at some point, you got to make that decision to stop, and you got to deal with the fact that you could and potentially may hurt a patient, and that's the risk. And that's where the disability companies, it's kind of ridiculous when they go, no, we think you're fine, but the disability company is not the person in the patient's mouth running the risk of potentially hurting that patient. So more often than not, for a dentist, unfortunately, it comes down to that if you are dropping instruments or you are unable to maintain position for administering a procedure or whatever, you have to discuss that with the doctor, and you got to make that decision to stop the work. Mm-hmm. Because if the disability carrier doesn't see that, they're going to have a hard time paying the claim.
Right.
Now, Steve, a lot of dentists want to have a successful practice, and they want to keep the practice going maybe and either bring in an associate, do a transitional sale. Can they collect full disability and still keep their practice going?
That's going to really depend on the policy and what they're going to determine as like earnings while on disability, things like that. I represented a dentist years ago who had 2 practices of his own. When he went out on disability, wasn't practicing whatsoever dentistry, managed the 2 practices, was able to purchase additional practices and just kind of oversee those practices. And his insurance carriers continued to pay a full benefit because his policy was his, work that he does specifically and related to the performance of dentistry. It wasn't this idea of he wasn't a multi-practice manager, if you will. Now he's more of a dental businessman, if you will. So it really kind of depends on the language of the policy, because you do see that sometimes, and if there's money still flowing through that's going to you, depending on that definition of earnings while on disability, it could be used to reduce down. That's why, too, I think a lot of times, sometimes dentists look to then try to sell their practices, or with business overhead expense policies, figure out a way to maximize getting payment under those overhead expense policies as well.
Right. Well,
and everything that Steve's talking about is true, and it's okay. It's not it's not a bad thing that you want to maximize your disability claim and also maximize profits of selling your practice, or maintain some sort of revenue coming in from another type of occupation that is related to dentistry.
And sometimes too, if you've been especially in a smaller area and you're a well-known commodity, sometimes other dentists want to come in and want to keep your name on the building just because it has credibility. It's like you're a brand in the community itself too. So you see that happen a lot.
Well, on the business overhead perspective, I litigated a case in North Carolina in federal court for a dentist where when he was selling his practice, he had a business overhead expense policy, but he kept the liability for a loan that he had on the practice. A lot of dentists take out loans to run their practice. And when he sold the business, he kept the name of the business and he kept that liability on that loan. And that loan went on for another 2 years. And he basically said, look, the business over, I still have a license, I still have to report to the state, I still have to maintain records for past clients, I'm not treating patients, but my business is open, I'm filing returns, and I still have this loan, which was about $20,000 a month. Disability carrier said, no, we're not going to continue to pay that expense. We litigated and the court found in our favor for that. Now, every business overhead policy is written differently because they talk about ongoing business. And the case law is all over the place on that, but that's an issue for dentists with these business overhead policies that should be discussed with us before you sell the practice as opposed to after, because you need to plan for that kind of thing to maximize your business overhead. Same thing, a lot of dentists own their businesses and they pay rent. It'd be great to own the building and still be able to get that rental payment, to come back, and that's another thing that could potentially be structured if handled in the appropriate manner. So, there's lots of issues with these dentists. The last thing to talk about with the dentists is some of these policies define occupation like in the national economy, and dentists practice in different ways. And what happens if you have a national economy definition versus the way in which the dentist was running his or her practice?
Well, I think they're going to look more than in generalities, at least from a national economy standard. And that's typically going to be if you're part of a larger group and that group has an employer-provided policy that you get through the group, not individually. They're still going to take a look at the type of dentistry, but at that point too, they're probably going to, most insurance companies on the group side are going to try to strip it down to more of these ideas of physical demands, light duty, ability and stuff. So they are there's more scrutiny with those. I have a dentist, her Guardian IDI policy, no problems, but on the group policy she had through the practice, it's always something with them, trying to get things paid, things are, there's a lot of issues with that. So you run into that, but I still think as a dentist, there are enough variations in the national economy that you can draw on for examples on that. So I don't see that as too huge of an issue. It's something that can be overcome, but it's certainly going to be more problematic in trying to establish what you were doing.
Right, and Cesar, I think dentists, one thing that always comes up again is they should be cautious in continuing to work with their medical condition, because the work it's very strenuous, it's very fine motor skill, and the longer you continue to work with whatever that medical condition is.
Well, often the medical conditions are occupational medical issues,
Right.
So it's from 30 years of, staying stooped, bent over, and, the strain on in maintaining static positions and working with their hands and their wrists and developing tremors and things like that. So yeah, absolutely, it's a risk.
So if you're a dentist watching our video, what we recommend you do is no matter what stage your claim is at, please send us a copy of your disability policy. We'll provide you with a complimentary review of that policy. If your claim has been denied, we'll gladly review your denial letter and let you know immediately how we can help you. We represent dentists all over the country, and I think we've seen every type of disability policy that's ever been written for a dentist, including the American Dental Association. We've helped hundreds of dentists with that specific policy,
West policies.
which is a lot of dentists have that policy, and it can be a good policy for dentists, but it has very specific nuances. And I think that we have done specific videos on that Great West policy, which I encourage you to look at our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking the button below, because we do these videos all the time, which we think you'll find helpful. And we look forward to the opportunity to speak with you.